There are vulnerabilities in Western societies, the very things which make them so apparently dominant and so powerful have an underside which is being exposed in these circumstances. And I think that's not dissimilar to the late Roman Empire. It probably, well, as Peter has said, from the vantage point of the time, it looked like its dominance would be eternal.
All empires that rise must fall. That feels almost like a natural law, like gravity. It's inevitable. There's nothing that you can do about it. Now, for the contemporary Western mind, the empire that stands above all others is Rome. And the collapse of Rome is a theme people return to again and again. That's particularly the case in recent years, primarily because the West, which is a form of empire in the 21st century, is suffering major crises of its own. Today's guests think there are massive lessons to learn for the West today from the Roman experience of the 4th and 5th centuries. And in fact, they believe that the West right now is facing the possibility of total civilizational collapse. Their book is absolutely superb, Why Empires Fall. Peter, Heather, John Rapley, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you so much.
I think this is the first time we've done an interview with two guests.
Is that right? Okay, well.
Well, we tend to talk over each other and disagree, so that'd be fine.
That's good. I insisted on it because the book we're talking about today, Why Empires Fall, is a work of both political analysis and history. One as a historian, one as a political scientist.
Well, political economist.
Political
yes.
economist.
Yeah.
And obviously, to discuss the book without one of those perspectives would be quite limiting. I have to say, it's one of the best books I've read this year.
Oh, thank you.
No, that's very nice to hear. We sweated blood actually,
oh, my Lord, if you
to
knew
find
how
a
many
way
iterations
to get the two. Well, you know, we knew we had the same sort of story to tell, but to find the way to tell it was where we're both represented and we're speaking with one voice and finding that rhythm. That was really a difficult piece of writing. The writing task. The intellectual task, in a sense, was not that hard, the argument, but the writing task was.
Well, I presume the intellectual task is quite intuitive. You know, you think this is the argument, it kind of makes sense to me, but now I have to digress through this other discipline. I have no real, I'm sure you do have a great understanding of each of the disciplines, but that's quite hard.
We do now.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. And just to be clear for people watching and listening, you are a historian of antiquity?
Yes, first millennium AD, basically. So fall of the Roman Empire and afterwards.
The goat era of the Roman Empire.
Yes, that's right.
And you are a political economist.
Political economist, yeah.
And you specialize in what?
In development economics. So, as I say, I've lived much of my life in developing countries, and so that has been my specialty. More recently, I say more recently, it began around the time I wrote the book with Peter. I started branching out into looking at global political economy, world economy, and so I was starting to see these sort of, this is quite a while ago now, this is now 20 years, these sort of trends emerging deep within the global economy, but particularly in the developing world, that were being overlooked by economists who were still using a very Western-centric approach, which everything that happens in the world is going to be determined by the major economies. And I was seeing there was actually some really significant activity in the margins. And that's why when Peter and I, who had been, acquaintances from our Oxford days, but hadn't seen each other in a dozen or so years, just by happenstance bumped into each other one Easter and compared notes. He'd just written a book on the fall of the Roman Empire and said essentially what brings down the empire was the activity on the periphery. And I said, well, this is remarkable. This is exactly what I'm looking at, is the way the rising periphery is going to make life increasingly difficult for the core of the world economy. And we said, there's a story there. Is there a common story to empires? And that's really how it began. And that was back around 2005, 2006. And then we just kept the conversation going until finally this emerged, as Peter said.
We share the interest in empires, but in the way that they change peripheries. And in fact, that is the kind of theme that has run through my work since I did my doctoral thesis back in the 1980s. I didn't realize that when I started the doctoral thesis. By the end of it, I suddenly realized what I was actually saying is that the process of ending the Roman Empire changed the peripheral actors much as it changed the empire. that there's a process of mutual transformation going on. And then we've spun that out into a much broader context and into this argument we're both quite invested in, I think it'd be fair to say. Yeah.
So let's get into the meat of this conversation. I'll start with you, really. There's lots of talk of sort of decline. There's lots of declinist rhetoric in the West, but obviously rhetoric and reality are two separate things. Let's put some numbers on this. Empirically, is quote-unquote the West, or what you call in this book the Western Empire, in decline?
Relatively, yes. And it has been now for a generation, since the turn of the millennium. By relative, we mean what is its weight in the total economic output of the planet? And at the turn of the millennium, it was about 4/5 of planetary output came out of the developed Western countries, the OECD economies. Today, that's down to about 3/5, and it's, relatively speaking, it declines every year, and that's because the global periphery is growing much more rapidly. So it's a relative decline, and as we do make very clear in the book, it doesn't have to be anything other than that, but it can become absolute decline, and in fact, at the moment, it has become absolute decline in some Western economies, principally because of domestic policy choices, and ironically, although this is what we anticipate in the book, it's happening in places where the domestic policy choices favor some kind of recreation of greatness, make America great again or take back control. These are the countries which tend to be having made that transition. There's a few of them now which I measure absolute decline in terms of, in the first instance, the first sign of it is a declining per capita income, per capita GDP. And we've already seen now Germany, Britain in the last few years, Canada, have already crossed that threshold. And others are very close to being on the threshold. The only Western economy at the moment which is doing particularly well is the United States, but even that one is a bit misleading because that's, if you take away the added debt incurred in the United States over the last decade from the added growth, the debt wipes out the total growth. I mean, it's hugely debt fueled and it's therefore very precarious, and it depends on for as long, and ironically, if Trump were to be elected and brought in his policies of restricting trade, it would probably tip the U.S. ultimately, after a couple of years, probably a boom. It would probably tip the U.S. into absolute decline if that were to happen. So we are very clear, if a different way of engaging with the rising periphery would enable Western countries, even though they'll continue to diminish in importance globally, both economically, and as a result, they have to accept politically, they can't dominate as they once did. They don't have to sort of go the way of the Roman Empire.
No, and I think it's worth saying that the absolute decline is tiny at the moment. The relative decline is the overwhelming factor that one observes in the planet. Per capita incomes in the West have not declined very much where they declined, but the global share of the world economy is the headline. That's what's really declined.
I mean, we could talk about this later on, but it does feel that since COVID, something particularly strange is happening. We were talking about real wages falling, blah over decades. But now in Germany, you're looking at 2 successive years of nominal GDP contraction, not per capita, nominal GDP contraction. And in the UK, you've had per capita GDP contraction probably for 2-3 years. Yeah. And that's post-COVID. So I do think that, you're absolutely right. And this is why I think it's such a salient book. Is that something, we've been looking at relative decline for quite a while, but now something really odd is beginning to happen to quite a few Western economies. So if we are in decline, if that decline is real, if it was relative and it could become absolute or is becoming absolute in some countries, at least for now, when was the apogee of the Western Empire? When was its pinnacle?
In economic terms, it would probably be 1999.
Yeah, it's such a good year, Party like it's 1999. Yeah. It was a gift for writing the book. But yes, it is 1999.
It was, and also because 1999 was Bill Clinton's State of the Union address, which was a sort of panegyric. We're going to have budget surpluses from here till kingdom come. We're going to get richer and richer. There was a real mood of triumphalism, and the Millennium Dome, everything to do with this kind of idea that we've created a whole new age, and then it begins to come crashing down. It's not apparent at first. There is the 2008 dot-com crash, but the 2000 dot-com crash. 2008 is what really is seen as the moment in which the problems begin, and there's never been with the exception of the US, although, as I say, there's an asterisk beside that, Western countries really have never emerged from the funk that began in 2008. 2020 complicates things. It complicates things because of the scale of debt taken on, and that has to do with vulnerabilities, I think, that were exposed in Western societies by the pandemic, and that will continue to be exposed. Interestingly, I think, and this is my next book is going to be on this topic, is that...
Not that you're plugging it.
Not that I'm plugging... Well, I haven't even written it yet.
It's an early plug.
That's always dangerous.
What I'm trying to do
dangerous.
is plug it to my agent. But, let me not say a book. That's too grandiose. My next project is how climate change will also, in contrast to the conventional wisdom, which is that climate change will hit poor countries the hardest, I think is going to hit, it is already hitting the developed countries the hardest. But that's the topic for another day.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that there are vulnerabilities in Western societies, the very things which make them so apparently dominant and so powerful have an underside which is being exposed in these circumstances. And I think that's not dissimilar to the late Roman Empire. It probably, well, as Peter has said, from the vantage point of the time, it looked like its dominance would be eternal, didn't it, Peter?
Well, it did. I mean, this is the big fact, in inverted commas, that changes all discussions about the Roman Empire now compared to what everyone thought only 40, 50 years ago, is the discovery that the Roman economy is at its peak just before collapse. In the 4th century, it's fundamentally an agricultural economy. So you've got to look and see, how many people are there in the countryside, how productive are they, et cetera, et cetera. And there was no way of measuring this, actually, until archaeologists found new techniques in the 70s and 80s, which is based on the capacity to derive numbers of settlements in the countryside based on pottery finds, added to the fact that you can date Roman pottery to within a decade. So you know where there's a settlement and also when there's a settlement. And it actually turns out that the Roman countryside is at its busiest across the vast majority of this landscape. And it's a huge landscape, it's Scotland to a rock. It's absolutely vast. The vast majority of that landscape has got more people in it doing more things in the countryside in the 4th century. And that is right on the eve of political collapse in the 5th. And this is the thing that would have all my sort of earlier peers rotating in their graves. But they'd be, the better ones would be just fascinated to know, oh my God, it's totally the opposite of what we thought.
Well, because the generic account is, and we'll come back to this, we'll talk about Edward Gibbon and whatnot, but the generic account is that 1st century AD Rome was the climax. That's when its cultural output is, we have Cicero, we have, Caesar, etc. Yeah. That's completely wrong.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's the apogee for Rome itself, the city. But the empire itself is so much more than the city. I mean, it starts being a conquest state run out of central and southern Italy for the benefit of a small number of people within it. With time we get to the 4th century, it's evolved. So if you're asking who's a Roman in the 4th century, it is the privileged landowning upper peasantry upwards everywhere between Hadrian's Wall and the Euphrates.
Wow.
Yeah. My old Ladybird book of British history when I was a kid had this picture of the Romans leaving Britain, and there were sort of 3 of them. There were a couple of soldiers and an administrator getting on a boat, and that was the Romans leaving Britain in around the year 400. But that's completely wrong. The Romans in Britain are the local villa landowning class by the 4th century, and they're learning Latin, they're wearing togas, they're living in villas, they are engaged in the political, cultural, and administrative structures of the empire. And this is the same trick that the empire has worked right across its land space. So, the definition of Roman changes, and with it, the sense of Roman prosperity.
So what is a Roman in the 4th century?
A Roman is someone of free status with Roman citizenship, and that is actually most of certainly all of the better off population within the empire. There's a substantial unfree population. We're not sure of the size of it, but maybe a third. They would not be citizens. There are various subgroups within the empire who don't have citizen status, but most people have citizen status.
So there's no ethnic conception of Romanity, Romanness?
No, Rome is a cultural concept. It's not an ethnic concept at all. It's a claim to living a more civilized, by which they meant more rational life. It's a very precise definition of civilization. They basically think of human beings as composed of an irrational body and a rational mind. And Roman citizens who are living in accord with God's plan for humankind, the rational mind controls the irrational body. Whereas the opposite, barbarians, that's all sex and drugs and rock and roll, and the body controls the mind. So it is a totally cultural term.
And quickly as well, this is a slight deviation, it was similar with regards to the Greeks, if I'm not wrong. So when Alexander goes all the way east, if you speak Greek, if you go to the gymnasium, etc., you are Greek.
Yes, yeah. It's all of the categories by which they measure the capacity of a society to generate rational human beings. So learning language in a structured way, learning philosophy, organizing yourself in self-governing local. I love it. Town councils as a source of rationality is such a lovely vision when you compare to the modern world. But because people are arguing together to arrive at the right outcome, so that's a rationalizing process, the process of argumentation. All of these are inherited from the Greeks.
We've lost so much. So you see what councils are like now, my goodness.
Yes, I know.
We are going to go through a lot, and I'm going to talk about the unique nature of the collapse of Roman Britain, etc. But quickly back to the Western Empire. I want to know when that quote-unquote Western Empire started. But before I do, you said that there's a decline in terms of share of global output, global GDP, from 4/5 to about 3/5 in 20 years. Has there ever been that kind of contraction in terms of percentage output for a world power as quickly before? Under these kinds of conditions, is that how quickly, for instance, Rome's economic might contracted over 20 years, 30 years?
We can't
really say. I tried these arguments out on my sort of modern imperial colleagues at King's College in London, where I teach, and we rumbled about with it a bit. And they actually made the point that things can move so much faster in industrial economies than they can in agricultural economies. Both growth and decline in an agricultural economy, the fixed capital assets are so fixed that unless you're inventing tractors or unless you're inventing man-made fertilizers, so the mechanization changes of the late 19th century, for instance, that come in the West, you can't dramatically change it. It's a slow process.
Okay, so quickly then, that shift from 4/5 to 3/5 is partly a function of technological change and the unique nature of how technology creates value in the modern era.
Well, yes, except I would add, I think you asked can we think of another case of world power declining that rapidly? And I do think probably I'd have to look more carefully at the actual timelines, but the Chinese empire in the 19th century, wholesale economic collapse, an absolute decline. And it's very rapid. So whether there's a 20-year period as rapid as what we've seen, possibly not, but possibly so. It really was quite dramatic. India and China together in 1800 that was the bulk of global manufacturing. By the end of the century, it's infinitesimal. It's just a wholesale collapse of the manufacturing economy, and with that, decline in incomes. So that would be the one case I can think of. Ottoman Empire is slower. It's a decay over the course of the 19th century. So I think we probably do have to look at the modern period for the reasons Peter says, for the very rapid, you can just speed things up in the modern period.
Yeah, I don't think you can get double-digit growth in an agricultural economy. And it's that in the periphery that is just changing the ball game. You can't do what China has done over the last 20, 25 years in terms of double digit.
Safavid Persia might be getting a new kind of pottery or something. They weren't, it wasn't that big a deal, sorry.
Hey, pots are really interesting.
Sorry. My apologies.
I'll get them started.
Yeah. So what's the genesis of the Western Empire? When does it start?
So our argument is that because of course many of the critics say, well, you can't possibly apply the model of the Roman Empire to the modern period because there is no longer an empire, and they will say the US is not an empire. But our argument is that they misunderstand. They treat the empire as being a unitary, centralized administrative entity, when in fact it really operates, as Peter writes in the book and has written elsewhere, as a confederal empire, held together very much by common culture. And this is what we say defines the Western Empire. And the period of ascendancy is really post-World War II. I mean, that is the glory age. That second half of the 20th century is a period where the West dominates the world. And it does it largely through a common culture, shared basic principles. So free markets, democracy, in principle, universal human rights. In principle, I think this is part of the fraying that begins at the edges and becomes very pronounced in recent years, is we're starting to see that universal rights are no longer universal. But nevertheless, these are the basic principles. And then a whole number of institutions. And in terms of the sort of the cultural capital, in the same way that Rome, long after it ceased to be the administrative center of the empire, was still the spiritual center of the empire. You wanted to learn Latin. You still, even if the best academies might not have been in Rome, there was still this idea of the eternal city. And in a very similar way to this day, I mean, I think one of the nationalist elites throughout the developing world still want to send their children to Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, and King's College London and such Western universities in order to root their own children in this idea of this universal dominant culture. Now, that is changing. But the idea of a common culture, that's what binds the West together, that emerges most clearly. And also, of course, the hegemony. One of the striking things about the Western age, US-led, is that all these other empires, these European empires, stop fighting with each other, and they become partners rather than foes under the umbrella of this US-led alliance. A remarkable achievement. In terms of global domination, no empire ever achieved that scale of domination. 4/5 of the planet's output, consumed by 15% of the planet's population. It's extraordinary. And, but of course, it gave rise to this view that this was the natural order of things and would be eternal. But nothing is.
I mean, the US itself, after 1945, it's one of the statistics in the book. I think, 1/3 of global output in 1945.
And more than half of manufacturing, yeah.
Wow. And then in Fort Knox, in terms of global gold reserves, there's something like 80%, 75%, something.
I don't know. Currently?
No, in 1945.
In 1945, it was very high because, of course, it was made illegal in the United States to hold gold. So all of the American gold stock ended up in the Federal Reserve. And then what happened with the adoption of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency in the global economy is that, gold just became less important in the holdings of other countries. And also, for various reasons, many governments don't want to hold their gold reserves domestically. They prefer to put them in safe places in London or in New York. Now, the scale of dominance of the United States in manufacturing and output is largely a function of the collapse of wartime Europe. And the wartime recovery, or the post-war recovery of Europe, leads to this very rapid drop in that scale of dominance. But in terms of the collapse, relatively, of manufacturing dominance, the really dramatic thing has been what's happened over the last 30 years with the rise of China. And it has happened so quickly. It simply caught Western governing elites off guard. They didn't see it coming. They thought, well, it's great. China gets richer. They'll buy more of our stuff. And by the time they realized China wasn't just buying all their stuff, they were actually selling everything that they were buying. And they have a real challenge on their hands. And they still haven't figured out what to do about it.
I mean, very quickly, even 4 or 5 years ago, I would be having conversations with people and I'd be saying, look, China will be leading in certain technological areas that the West won't be. And that's we talk about it in the book. That's not happened at all, actually, for several hundred years. The Atlantic has been driving global technological innovation. And just in a few areas, grant me that, EVs or whatever, China will be in the ascendancy. And even 4 or 5 years ago, very clever people, very highly qualified people refused to admit that. And now, of course, we have China's, at least in electronic vehicles, amongst other things,
Yeah,
doing
and,
extraordinarily well. And like you say, there's not really a response to that from global elites. I mean, go back further. I remember before the global financial crisis, as a young man in my 20s, you would have this ideology from people like Evan Davis or whatever, so mainstream political economics journalists, very smart people, and they'd be saying, well, we've given all our manufacturing away, but we're moving up global commodity chains because now you can buy a latte. And I think now people look at that and they think, what? I'm sure even Evan Davis thinks, what on earth was I on about? But what you're saying is that we're 16 years after the global financial crisis, there's still not really a growth model in the aftermath of that.
Not really. I don't think, and partly because I don't think there is a growth model to be had in the conventional sense we understand growth. I have argued that the extrapolations we have made based on what has been a truly extraordinary period in world history, that period of Western dominance, which in no small measure owes to the fact that for the first 30 years of the post-colonial period, developing countries are still trying to find their feet. I mean, they're still literally, as I say, because I live in developing countries, and so I would speak with the people who are actually involved in the process of state building. I mean, they were coming into offices which had no staff, they had no desks, they had not even, this is the 1940s, 1950s, no typewriters. They were literally, and so when it came to trade negotiations, I mean, they were learning as they were doing. But by the 1980s, by the 1990s, as they start to find their feet, they start to evolve a diplomatic tradition in many cases. Their trade negotiators get more seasoned. They begin to form tactical alliances. You get the beginning of a pushback, the kind of very thing that Peter says takes place militarily in antiquity, but in the modern period takes place largely in these trade negotiations, among other things. And this pushback where they start to, and it's not immediately apparent, but they're negotiating what are for them good deals. And I don't think, as I say, the elites in Western countries are saying, well, will this trade deal with China, this is what it's a terrific thing. From the vantage point of 1990s America, you have all these cheap goods coming in from China, which keeps the inflation rate down, which means that interest rates stay low, which means you can have a stock market boom and a property boom, and everybody's getting richer. Everybody in America is getting richer on paper. But what they're not paying attention to is exactly what you say, Aaron, which is, could this one day lead to a situation where they actually take over whole sectors? And they are, and they certainly are. I mean,
and they're bound to do so. I think the extra complicating factor in there is that you've got a lot of the investment funds for this industrial development are coming from the West, and individual Westerners in their pension funds and their investment bonds or whatever are making money out of it. So it's actually a very complicated process. I mean, deciding, in a sense, there's not a national interest anymore because development in the periphery is in the interest of those who got money to invest or who part of these big investment bodies, whether, pension funds like the university's pension fund to which I belong, it's got staggering amounts of money that it's floating around, and quite a lot of that is invested in these overseas enterprises.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? You'll hear certain rhetoric from Washington about China, but then you'll go see Tim Cook opening up a new store in Chongqing or whatever, and you think, well, that's the rhetoric. That's what's actually going on. Let's go back to antiquity, and I know we're flitting between the two, but now we're going to try and synthesize why the collapse of Rome and the potential collapse of the Western Empire have these congruences. So what is the formulaic account for why Rome collapses? Why is it wrong? And what's your account?
I think the formulaic account is that it was always too big, and that eventually it can't sustain its own capacity to rule over this huge space. I mean, it is a huge space. It sounds big now, Scotland to Iraq, but actually the fastest land speed is something like 15 to 20 miles a day for moving stuff around. So, we do easily 10 or 20 times that. This space in terms of lived human experience is 10 or 20 times as big as it looks on the map now. So it looks big now, but it's actually more like governing the entirety of Eurasia as a single unit in the modern world. That's the scale of the governmental problem that you're facing. And the standard account is that Rome has this kind of period of conquest, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, colossal period of prosperity in and around Rome, and eventually that runs out. So from 2nd, particularly the 3rd century onwards, you get internal civil war and economic decline. And a combination of those two factors, I mean, Gibbon threw in Christianity, but I think he was doing that tongue-in-cheek. It's more a comment about Christians, I think, and his own view of Christianity, but that's another question. But fundamentally, these internal factors of economic decline and civil war are what stresses the system, and it falls apart. And obviously outsiders are involved because the Western successor states are run by Anglo-Saxons and Goths and Burgundians and Franks who didn't used to live inside the empire, but they're a kind of effect, not cause, of the process of imperial collapse.
And this informs wholesale many accounts, many in your take, erroneous accounts of the kinds of problems we face in the West right now. So why did Rome really collapse in the 4th and 5th centuries?
Yeah, well, this is where the point that I mentioned earlier, that we now know the economic decline doesn't happen. In fact, the imperial economy is expanding right up to the moment of collapse. It's not an economic problem. It's obviously, there is a governmental political issue. You try running all of Eurasia as one unit and see how you get on. Historians are a bit bizarre. They sometimes think that, although we see in the world around us that perfection does not exist in terms of human organization, they think it should exist. So if you can find any kind of issue with any kind of past society, it's collapsing. It's about to collapse. Oh my God. People are disagreeing with one another. Yeah, all right.
It's like that Tucker Carlson meme. It's over. That's what historians of antiquity, is it?
Yeah, that's right. It's very funny, moral decline, and Romans have become more argumentative in the 4th century, which is why we've got civil wars. They're not learning their Latin endings properly and being rational and organizing things. So we know it's not economic decline. The governmental issue is real. On the other hand, this entity lasted in full extent for half a millennium, 500 years. It makes the British Empire look like a joke in terms of its capacity. So, and it's the same governmental problem all the way through. In a sense, you can argue that the Romanization of provincial elites, though in one sense a success story, complicates the governmental issue because you have to combine Roman voices that are now equally Roman all across this landscape. And I think that's true. I think that it does become more complicated. When it was a conquest state run out of southern Italy for southern Italian landowners' benefit primarily, that's fairly straightforward, the political process. So that is true. But, the basic issue of running this space as a unit it's worked for half a millennium, 500 years. The time separating us from fairly early in the reign of Henry VIII. He's still on his first wife 500 years ago. That's a very long time, a really seriously long time.
And of course, it was around before the empire as well.
Yeah.
The first Roman kings are 500 BC?
More like 700.
Oh my goodness.
They date by consuls, and the official foundation date is 753 BC. From the
this is when you have Romulus and Remus suckling from the wolf.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Wow. I mean, that kind of longevity, 1,200 years, is just incomprehensible to us.
Yeah, it is, as a political unit. So what interests me is looking at the world around the empire. And that wasn't where I thought I was going when I started my doctoral thesis. But what you see, what I saw in the 4th and 5th century was that the groups which create the successor states of the Roman Empire are created on Roman soil. They are new confederations formed out of smaller units on Roman soil. They form partly to survive in the face of Roman counterattack, and also to predate on Roman territory. There's a mixture of defense and attack in that. So things like Visigoths, Vandals, whatever, are new confederations. They're not old, ancient peoples. They are something that's created via political process of trying to survive in the face of Roman attack on Roman soil. Subsequent work then expanded that view to look at the backstory of these confederations, and what you see in both the historical and the archaeological sources is that the period between, say, 100 and 350, so the backstory before these groups come onto Roman soil, is one of massive social, economic, and political transformation in the non-Roman world around the Roman Empire. In the time of Tacitus in the 1st century BC, you've got about 60 Germanic tribes mentioned in his Germania on the territory of what's now Benelux, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Western Poland. You know, that's not a big space. If you've got 60 things there, they're all tiny. And actually any type of alliance between them is temporary and disappears and whatever. By the 4th century, we've got a much smaller number of bigger confederations already. And you can see in the archaeology that their economic productivity, agricultural productivity has increased. There are more people. And actually, you couldn't have built the kind of confederations that I see forming on Roman soil in the late 4th and 5th century in the 1st century, because the starting blocks would have been so tiny. You know, you'd been trying to put together 20 things rather than 3 or 4 things. So, and then you then have to think, well, why has the Germanic world changed? And the Roman Empire forms a series of transformative relationships with its periphery. It wants raw materials, foodstuffs, leather, etc., for its armies, which are placed on the frontier. It interferes with them diplomatically. It sometimes creates client kings. It wants someone stable to do business with. And it puts in motion a whole series of positive and negative reasons why these groups should form larger units, why it will be advantageous for them to move from this world of 55 or 60 really tiny things to more like a dozen more solid things. And that's what we see.
So it's a move to kind of a Germanic oligopoly.
Yes.
Industry consolidation would be the sort of modern way of putting it. So this is really interesting. What your argument is that through long-term contact with the Roman Empire, we see organizational, technological development of the periphery. It becomes more affluent, more capable, and that is the ultimate challenge to the empire.
Yes. It changes the balance of strategic power, basically. So the Roman Empire stops expanding because it's not worth it expanding it anymore in the 1st century. The cost-benefit equation of taking over another bit of German forest is just not advantageous. It's not really defeated. Everyone looks at Arminius's defeat of Varus and the loss of 3 legions. But
this is in the first century.
Yeah, that's right. In the first decade of the 1st century, AD 7. Oops, I think.
Battle of Teutoburg, right?
Yes, that's right. Where they've actually found the site of it. So,
well, that's cool.
Yeah.
Is that where his statue is, or is that
No, that's in the wrong place.
Oh dear.
That was a 19th century guess because people didn't know, but it's actually about 80 kilometers further north from there.
Oh, it is bad, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's kind of funny.
They should move it.
Right continent.
Yeah.
So, and this goes to the argument of the contemporary world economy. On those borders thing, it's interesting that obviously they stop at the kind of Rhine and the Danube, and there's this cost-benefit thing. We will come back to this because, of course, there's this debate about whether or not Britain was ever actually a sort of beneficial asset for the Roman Empire. So this idea that the empire, the imperial core, is weakened not because of internal fragmentation, domestic infighting, but because of the development and growing prosperity of the periphery. That's basically what you claim to be seeing in the first 2 decades of the 21st century and before, of course.
Right. I mean, just to give you a simple illustration, very contemporary, before coming here, I mentioned I was in Canada, and as I left Canada, there was a diplomatic spat between India and Canada over the Canadians have expelled some Indian diplomats because the Indian intelligence services, turns out, was involved in the murder of a Canadian Sikh activist who'd taken refuge in India. And it's very interesting. It's been a very humbling experience for Canada, this whole affair with the Indians, because the country had become very complacent during the period of Western ascendancy. Its view was always, well, India, if we have a conflict with India, we'll just sort of impose some sanction and they'll fall in line. But suddenly the balance is tipped. Canada needs India more than India needs Canada at this point. I mean, it bears in mind that I always love to say this is essentially symbolic, but that the East India Company is now owned by an Indian. The biggest corporation in human history, which no longer exists for all intents and purposes, but the shell was bought by an Indian, just to make the point. This is the direction of travel now. And that's very similar to the situation. And so time and again, Western governments find themselves diplomatically rather than militarily, as in antiquity, on the back foot, or having to engage, or having to find new ways of doing things. I mean, David Cameron had the experience, of course, when he sort of came out in office, came out and made belligerent statements about China, but very quickly realized when the Chinese said, well, we will, reconsider our trade relationship with you if you push this, and, became very friendly to China. I mean, I wouldn't want to use the tail wagging the dog analogy, but there is definitely a change in the strategic balance between what was the periphery of the world economy and now remains increasingly, in the case of China, becoming a new part of the core in many respects, as you say.
Yeah, and this is the central resonance that underlies the entire book. The finding this observation in two very different contexts, and in fact, you can add a third, because development in first millennium Europe progresses in two stages. Basically, Central Europe develops around the fringes of the Roman Empire. Then in the sort of Carolingian or Ottonian period, the center of empire has shifted to Northern Europe. And it's only then that you see equivalent development in Northern and Eastern Europe. So going further beyond that. So the Roman period development did not move outside of Central Europe, its immediate neighbors. There's then a further sequence of long-term transformative relationships around the new imperial core that emerges in sort of North Central Europe, that transforms Eastern Europe. So we've got three examples, not two.
So just to be clear, before we move on, this idea that Rome's borders stop where they do for quite clear commercial reasons, is that because of the quality of the soil? Is it because of the hardwood forests? They're just very hard to chop down. I mean, that's a very different kind of forest to what you get in Southern Europe, for instance. What's the killer in terms of not going beyond the Danube and the Rhine? Long term. Yeah,
long term it would be all right. It's the short to medium term, which, as I'm sure you know better than I do, most politicians are not operating beyond. The idea of long-term policies is such a joke, because that's not the political cycle. You have to work within the political cycle, and so it is with Rome. The killer is, the great triumphs held in Rome after conquering Egypt came back with, obelisks and paintings and everything that used to be in pharaohs' tombs, and rich silks and spices. The ones from Europe came back with, a nice piece of wood. It's really nice wood. It's the political capital to be gained from further conquests in Northern Europe is very limited. And if they put up a fuss, which they do, because they don't want to be conquered, then the gains are kind of minimal. There's just nothing there. It's a perfectly good landscape. Give it 200 years of sustained agricultural improvement, as our 18th century forebears would talk about it, and you make it into worthwhile country to have. But no one's thinking in that time frame. Politicians don't.
And fundamentally, that remains the case for centuries. I mean, Europe until well into, I say the modern age. Let me not say the modern age, but in the middle of the second millennium, it's still an economic backwater in terms of its both its manufacturing capacity, in terms of the riches that are generated, in terms of, in so many respects, its cultural output. It sees itself as being very vulnerable very marginal, and it is to the world economy. I mean, it's a dramatic transformation that occurs in a very short period of time, the rise of Europe. In fact, there was one economic historian who called it the European miracle. And it's probably not an exaggeration to say it does appear miraculous because it is so sudden. And it really has to do with, changes that suddenly make certain sources of energy suddenly very useful. Like coal, it changes in shipbuilding, changes in military technology. There are a number of explanations that have been made for it. But Europe remains that kind of, relatively speaking. I mean, there's stories of Marco Polo going to, meet Kublai Khan and the riches he presents him from Europe come across as trinkets. This is the best you've got, buddy.
What is for you? What is the explanation for the emergence of Europe as this distinctive political area, which actually is increasingly at the forefront of technological and economic development? Because, like you say, 1000 AD, that definitely ain't the case. But clearly something changes by the 15th, 16th century. So some people say, obviously, discover the Americas, shipbuilding. But the Chinese still are the ones that develop gunpowder, paper. So what is it? Because China's very much at the sort of the leading edge of technology, even as Europe is on this upward trajectory.
It is. And I don't think anybody can claim to have the explanation. There have been many ones put forward. We briefly touched upon them in the book. There's the environmental explanations of people like Jared Diamond, who say it has to do with the population density and the direction of movement and trade. Geographic explanations that have to do with that when seaborne transport historically has always been or waterborne transport's always been the most inexpensive, and that Europe has a large number of navigable waterways. The ratio of navigable waterways to the actual land mass is very high, and so therefore there's a lot of trade complementarities. The geography is varied. Political explanations which have to do with the fact that you don't get, after the fall of the Roman Empire, you never really get the emergence of a new imperial core the way you do.
Not a stable one. No.
Not a stable one. And so Europe's very instability, the very thing that makes it look backwards, maybe actually because there was constant conflict, which meant that gunpowder couldn't be used for ceremonial purposes. It had to find practical applications. And then in so many other ways, military technology, and then the combination of military and navigational technology. And the fact that Europe was, in fact, relatively speaking, so poor that whatever surpluses were produced were used to import luxury goods from Asia, which meant you had to find a way to get to Asia. And if the overland route was closed, that pushed the deep sea navigation. And once they got those two things together, they were able to put guns on ships and go long distances, of course, because European ships are able to operate for years away from home in a way that the Chinese Navy, which largely, of course, infamously turned inward, the Chinese Empire just turned inward and basically did away with its Navy.
Yeah, I mean, if you think that the creation of European empires requires military superiority, there's a strong case to be made that military superiority is established by fighting other Europeans. And it is this... China's problem is that it's an empire, so that they don't have the internal rivalries that are actually going to set loose this Darwinian process of military evolution.
And that geography isolates it from its enemies.
Yeah.
The Gobi Desert in the west, the mountains in the north, and so and the Himalayas in the south, and so it is essentially a relatively peaceful kingdom, and that's its problem, ironically, compared to Europe.
Nasty Europeans.
Yeah, nasty Europeans who just could never miss the opportunity for a scuffle.
Well, no, actually, I mean, I mentioned Henry VIII, but, Henry VIII has this huge windfall by abolishing the monasteries and taking over 25% about 25% of the land of the kingdom he takes into his hands, and he blows it all on one bloody war with the French, basically.
Wow.
I do find Henry VIII totally despicable from all kinds of ways, but that's what his reign was.
I mean, I saw, going back to Twitter, somebody said, oh, when did it all start? When was the beginning of the end kind of thing? And some people say 2008 or the 90s. And then somebody said, no, it's the dissolution of the monasteries. But it really hits you when you go to the bigger ones, right? You go, wow, this is like an intellectual, economic, social powerhouse. And these were obliterated. I didn't know that it was all just wasted in one war.
Yeah, no, he blew the lot on the costs of one failed war against France.
Wow. Yeah. Now that is a policy failure.
It is.
We're harsh on today's politicians, but my goodness.
I mean, he's the Vladimir Putin of his time.
So this is going to encompass both of you here. You basically say that with the deterioration of the security system on the edges of the Roman Empire, that provincial elites basically they do a calculation and they say, look, it's not really worth actually claiming allegiance to the core anymore. I'd rather throw my hat in with these Alan tribes or Burgundians or whatever, and that creates a distinctive problem. They're kind of flipped because of an erosion in what you call the social contract. The social contract is that the centre provides security from these barbarian hordes. It's no longer doing it. So these provincial elites flip. Can you illuminate what that means very quickly?
Yeah, it's a double deal, really. They pay taxes. I mean, the Roman Empire taxes agricultural production to fund its large professional armies. I mean, they're not that great, but in the context, it's a serious military machine, and it's twofold protection. It's protection against internal enemies because this landowning class is probably only 5-8% of the total population. So the people who really benefit from the Roman Empire are the landowning classes, the people who own villas, and the Roman state maintains the legal structures which guarantee their security of property, etc. But also the external protection against external enemies. That's when Roman emperors have to stand up and justify taxation. They always talk about barbarians. This is why we pay taxes. What happens in the sort of crux 5th century period is that for, I think, sort of separate and contingent reasons, these large new barbarian confederations form on Roman soil, and they're eating away at the tax base. And as a result, the military capacity of the center declines, and you reach a kind of tipping point, which is all within the period of 450 to 475, but slightly different time in different places. Actually, in Britain, it's a bit earlier than that, where local elites realize that the center can no longer protect them. And they're faced with, what are we going to do? When your wealth is based on a piece of land, an estate, and most Roman members of the Roman elite don't have lots of estates. They have a small collection of lands in one place. You cannot move. You don't have the luxury of running off to a safer place. You have to somehow effect the transition of your ownership into the new order and protect your asset base. So yes, whether they like it or not, they're sucked into a relationship with whichever barbarian group is emerging as the most important in their area. And some do it slightly earlier and slightly more willingly. They smell the coffee sooner. Some are dragged there kicking and screaming. There's a very nice letter collection from a bloke who lives in Clermont-Ferrand. And you can see he and his peers, they're making that decision with greater and less willingness at slightly earlier and slightly later dates, but they're all forced to. I mean, he's led the resistance to the Gothic takeover of his local region for a long time, but he ends up a hostage at the Gothic court, and he writes a praise poem about the Gothic king to make up, because he's got no choice. His land is where it is. It's now within the territory that's effectively controlled by the Gothic king. If he's going to survive this crisis, he's got to do a deal.
I do like as well the colour that you provide with the barbarian, quote unquote, barbarian court often being quite enamoured with Roman culture. And is it like Clovis's grandsons having poems recited and so on? We call them barbarians, but they were often very interested in classical Roman culture.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a Roman term of abuse. And there's an even better one, which I use for teaching, which is the same guy who wrote this letter collection. At first, he thinks he can use a previous Gothic king to sustain Roman rule. And he writes this long account of what this king is like, basically presenting him as a Roman ruler. The subtext of that is this guy is not a barbarian, he's actually a Roman. It's very like when Mrs. Thatcher came back and said, of Gorbachev, we can, she said, we can do a deal with this man. Mm-hmm. I can't remember
I don't remember the exact language.
The exact words are disappearing, but there was after their formal public meeting, there was this statement, okay, he's one of us.
We can work with him.
Yeah.
And it is as well, I don't know the formulation in the book, but it's really interesting how basically you talk about these people who are effectively political entrepreneurs, these barbarians, who are at the forefront of economic aggrandizement for their peoples, embracing new technologies. They're also necessarily really good at fighting.
Yes.
Necessarily, which is obviously a major problem. Now, are there parallels with today? This idea that the social contract is fraying with what we would call provincial elites today. I don't even know what those people would be, where they are, and that this is creating problems for the imperial core.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take Peter's point about the tax base being eaten away, it is being eaten away today, but it's being done in a different manner. And the principal difference is if we speak in economic terms of factors of production, labor and capital, that in antiquity, capital was immobile and labor was mobile. I mean, the capital was basically agricultural farmland. It was aqueducts. It was roads. You can't pick them up and move them elsewhere. They are where they are. And so the labor, however, was relatively speaking mobile. The barbarians were able to invade and could occupy the capital. Today, it's the reverse because of immigration controls. And this is something, the complete fallacy about talking about how immigration will bring down the West because that's likened to barbarian invasions. The immigration is controlled by the recipient country. The vast majority of foreigners on British soil have been given permission by Britain to enter.
Yes.
Very few. And even in a country like the United States, it's only about 5% of the immigrant population, which is illegal. So it's really striking how immobile labor is compared to antiquity. Where it's mobile, of course, is in the global periphery. These huge migration, the biggest migration in human history has taken place in the last couple of generations, much of it in China, now India. And it's moving to the coastal regions and the riverine cities of the global periphery where they are forming vast labor reserves. So you have these labor reserves and capital is completely mobile. Capital can be, as we know, you can do it from your mobile phone. You can move money. Yes. I do it all the time. I'm moving money.
I'm glad to hear you've got some money. That's very nice.
But I'm moving my debts. But nevertheless, this is why I travel so much. I'm avoiding my creditors. No, in all seriousness, money is very easy to move. And so vast pools of capital, rather than vast pools of labor, are being moved from core to periphery. Now, who is doing it? Well, it's being done by the large institutional investors who are seeking the higher returns of the periphery. What's driving that process? And this is one of the very things which is perhaps one of the more controversial aspects in the book, as we point out largely. I mean, those travel stores being set up in London to cater to, relatively speaking, well-off pensioners, it is pension funds driving a great deal of this process. Private equity is buying up a lot of, in Britain, these housing estates that have the worst records for sort of driving out people and then upgrading and then raising rents are largely owned by private equity funds, which are themselves, when you trace it back far enough, are owned by pension funds in Western countries. They're in no small measure driving the housing crisis because inflating rents is a very simple way to raise returns. And it's a simple thing to do if you have the political heft, as they do, because when you command those kinds of pools of capital, you have political influence. So the very large-scale outsourcing of production is driven by Western, the 1%, if you will. Now, when we talk about the 1%, we like to imagine people in pinstripe suits with very expensive cigars, drinking very expensive whiskey. But in fact, the 1%, if you basically are a homeowner with a defined benefit pension today in a Western country, you are part of the global 1% statistically. And that's a very large share of the population of some Western countries. And they react with alarm when I point this out to them, and very obviously very defensively. Nobody wants to see themselves as part of this process.
Is that still the case? I mean, that's, I have a mortgage, but the point is, it's a debt, it's not an asset.
When I say a mortgage-free home.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So basically, you're talking about a retired person who's paid off their mortgage if they have a defined benefit pension.
Yeah, it's that combination, the two things.
That is, then you are flush. Those are the people
they're
the people in the garden centre every Sunday spending like, 300 quid.
And going on cruises.
Going on cruises, traveling abroad, going to Bali and Mexico 2 or 3 times a year, and would think of themselves as middle class. They're probably driving a Volvo or whatever. They may well, within the rubric of
I drive a 20-year-old Volvo. That doesn't...
I'm sure Volvo would be very grateful for it being viewed as this kind of aspirational
I laugh because
brand.
I've used Peter's cars when he's away on holiday, and they have a tendency to sort of
they're also a bit moldy.
A lot of maintenance, and yes, but they're lovely cars. They are very good.
Yes, I'm very fond of them.
They still move. I mean, that's the important thing. But nevertheless, no, it's a relatively rarefied group. They don't think of themselves as that. But of course, they're becoming more rarefied because defined benefit pensions are becoming, there's a reason governments are doing away with them, because in order to generate the capital, you have to squeeze very high returns, partly because populations are living longer. And the
I mean, and this is the other bit to throw in. It would be the change in the demographic pattern in modern populations and the capacity of healthcare to sustain and extend lifespans. This is where the other erosion of the social contract is going to come, because there's a kind of essentially infinite demand for healthcare. Of course, every time there's a new drug or a treatment for Alzheimer's, we all want it because, but they're all very expensive. And, you can keep people unless people are unlucky, and, you can keep people pretty well until they're about 80. But once you get over 80, you start consuming a lot of, you might be struck down before that, I realize, and I don't want to be sounding flippant about that. But thinking about the aggregate numbers, looking around me at the people I know, people are pretty well, unless they're unlucky and get cancer or whatever. They're pretty well until they're about 80. And then sometime between 80 and 90, usually something happens and they start to need a lot more care. But this is all very expensive. And we're seeing a problem in terms of being able to afford that care through state structures. And as our population gets older and older and the birth rate declines, then the number of older people in terms of ratios is increasing as well as absolutely. This feeds into government debt. And I actually think that debt is the governmental debt is really the equivalent of barbarians eating away at the tax base. I mean, on the one hand, John is right. The transfer of industrial capacity overseas is eating away at capacity to increase your tax base via taxes on industrial production, but we're also eating away at the spending power of existing revenues by racking up debt. So as soon as interest rates rise, then government is actually spending a lot of its annual revenues on servicing its existing debt, while still facing this pressure to increase spending, which is essentially infinite.
So, and just to illustrate that, I mean, the fiscal contract breaking down, the social contract is one of the ways governments have started dealing with it over the last few years, is they are starting to effectively tax some people more than others. One of the ways this shows up I argue, is in housing, the housing crisis, the housing prices. The fact that these prices are being inflated, it's not being done by government, but it's being assisted by government policy and central bank policy to inflate the value of fixed assets, which inflates rents, which means, and that was always seen to be part of the social contract in most Western countries, that as a young person in your 20s, you could get married and buy a house. And now that's beyond reach for more and more people. And that's causing a sense of resentment. And it's not, in a sense, in the fiscal contract. It's not part of the tax contract, but it is part of the tax contract in another respect, that young people are also doing things like they're having to pay higher school fees. You see, you can cut spending in a certain area and say we're living within our means. But if what you mean is you're transferring what had been part of the fiscal contract you're privatizing it onto a certain part of the population, you're going to stir resentment. And that's the kind of breakdown that we're seeing now. It's interesting, in Western democracies, we're seeing this novel phenomenon of young people voting for the far right, of young people voting for Trump. They're just so fed up with the way things are going. It was always, the life cycle effect in politics was always presumed to be that as a young person, you vote left and gradually you become more conservative as you get older. But in fact, now the most reliably democratic voters are, in fact, baby boomers, the retired population.
This is in the US.
In the US.
I mean, what's interesting with the UK as well is that millennials are moving further left. Mm-hmm. And I see this with my own birth cohort. And, and understandably, you graduated in the global financial crisis, you were raised with quite progressive values, you remember a period of sustained prosperity, you could call it social democracy, even under Blair. And they're moving left. I certainly have moved left as I've gotten older. I mean, I was already left. I see that with other friends too. But like you say, with Gen Z, with Gen Alpha, it's very different. And I think there's a mistake being made by millennials that actually, everybody's going to move left because living standards are stagnating. Actually, we need to begin to understand we're quite a distinctive cohort. And like you say, you go outside of the UK, you go to France, you go to Italy.
Right.
That it's millennials too. So it's quite a distinctive thing with millennials, just in Anglo-America. And I do think there's this interpretation of generation left. The young people will be more left-wing, they'll save the world. I wouldn't be so sure. If you read, I was reading Stefan Zweig, Memoirs of a European, this memoir he writes before he kills himself. Stefan Zweig, Austrian Jew, novelist. Amazing book. And he talks about the passion of young people for fascism. And he said, all of a sudden, all the young people were reactionaries. And I couldn't understand it. It was the complete opposite of the early 20th century. And I think, well, maybe we're going to move to somewhere quite similar. I mean, it seems to be the case in Italy and France and maybe the US too, certainly among young men, right? Mm-hmm. Young men now in the US are moving right at an extraordinary pace.
Compared to the way they did in previous generations. Yeah. I mean, they're still predominantly left, but they're less left than they were. Whereas the older voters are the ones most invested in the Democratic Party, which is, I find, very interesting. So the kind of model we have is that the source of right-wing reaction is always going to come from older people clinging to past ways, is being confounded in places particularly like France, like Germany. Well, East Germany, I think it is in Germany, is sort of peculiar to it. There is a regional
France,
dimension.
Netherlands, Italy, it's definitely a thing,
Yeah.
And I suppose this is the point I want to move on to now, which is about, an existential crisis for the West, potential quote-unquote collapse of the Western Empire. It's happened before. It's a hypothesis of this book. It can happen again. And that fraying of the social contract, which you talk about in the book, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking about the world that surrounds me. You've spoken about young people. The average nurse graduates with £50,000 worth of debt in this country. Why on earth should she stay here? And I think this is quite funny. People are worried about immigration. Worry about emigration. Worry about very talented young people in 10 to 15 years as this continues going. And I do think we might see something like, it could even come from a centre-right party. We'll scrap tuition fees in specific industries. You cannot leave the country for 10 or 15 years, which is kind of, you'd equate that kind of policy with a developing world country. I can see that happening in Britain, for instance. But it's not just there. Crime, high streets. You see it with domestic elites here, wealthier people here, which often in the show, we don't have much time for them. At the end of the day, if you lose your £50,000 watch and it's stolen on the streets of London, tough, right? People have bigger problems. But At the same time, if you look at the court system policing since 2010 in this country, since austerity, it isn't free for all. That's just a fact. And lots of crime has been effectively decriminalised in terms of, I think you talk about it with sexual assault and rape. One in 100 cases actually ends in some successful prosecution.
Yes.
I mean, it does feel like wherever you go, housing, law and order, education, that social contract is just disappearing. And that's a problem politically.
It is a huge problem politically. And in terms of, I do think that you touched upon something, Aaron, which is definitely a risk for Western societies. One is they're going to become less attractive to immigrants. I mean, I think they're overlooking just how competitive the market for immigrants is already becoming. Because Western countries can't maintain the fiscal contract without immigration. If they actually block it, I can guarantee you that absolute decline follows. But they're also potentially driving away young people for the very reasons you say. I mean, when you talk to young people about what is the biggest obstacle, usually it is, they're graduating with a lot of debt. Also, if they're not graduating, they're just going straight out of high school. The cost of everything because of the cost of housing. And I think, economic models that sort of focus on inflation fail to capture the degree to which the cost of real estate makes everything else expensive, because the shopkeeper has to raise prices if the rent is going up to cover the cost of the rent. But it's not a natural state of affairs. In most of the world, property is not expensive. You can take your income. My children grow up in Jamaica, and my son keeps saying, if I can only just take my income and go live in Jamaica, I'd live like a king. And so, the plan then is, well, okay, buy a house, retire, sell the house, go live like a king in a developing country where the cost of everything is cheaper because land is not expensive. The expense of land here is entirely a function of policy. It is not a natural economic outcome, and it's certainly not a function of property density because population density, because you have much more densely populated societies where the cost of housing is quite reasonable. So it's
Give me an example.
Singapore is, they did the sensible thing, which they nationalized property. All real estate belongs to the government. You can get a long lease, but the government regulates the costs. And if you're a Singaporean, you have access to affordable housing. And that means that you have a lot. That's why Singapore has such good street food, is because people have a lot of money. And you don't, trying to set up any kind of food vending business in London, if you're not going to generate quite a lot of turnover in your first year, you won't survive unless you have an investor. But the idea, I see this all the time in cities in the developing world, and which is one of the reasons why what I find really interesting, Aaron, is that if you look at surveys among young people, those like Pew Research Center, which do surveys of young people across the world, one of the striking things is that this sort of sense of gloom you get among young people is particularly strong in Western countries and many developing countries. And as I say, living as I do, I'm heading off to South Africa this evening, and I talk to young people there. The challenges of life in a developing country are immense, but the sense that I can build something and I can get ahead, even in a country like South Africa, which would not be considered one of the success stories at the moment, there are just so many ways a young person who's got initiative and ambition can, in fact, get ahead, whereas talking to young people here, they just encounter obstacle after obstacle. And those obstacles have been put in place because we need to actually, the housing crisis is very much a manufactured crisis. It's a function of policy designed to generate returns for the investors in those assets, which brings us back to the 1%. It's an inescapable fact that has to be confronted, which is if we are going to rebuild the fiscal contract, can we continue to deliver outsized benefits to one group at the expense of the rest, or will we have to? And the answer, of course, every politician gives, I'll give the same benefits to everybody else. We'll lower the retirement age, we'll guarantee, and that, then you get trust-like moments. And France is going to go through this eventually because of their pension system. It's simply not sustainable on its current trajectory. And that means having a frank conversation. Well, who gets what? Because as it is, as we say in the book, the beauty of empire, of being the dominant player in the world, is you can outsource exploitation. In the 19th century, because you acquire an empire, who are the biggest supporters of empire in Britain in the 19th century and into the 20th century? It's the working class, because they're direct beneficiaries of this. They're now part of the master race. They're now getting the benefits of empire.
But it's economic as well as, this is
economic as well as cultural.
Often people think it's purely cultural.
No, it's
not.
economic. Absolutely.
It's absolutely economic.
That's how you can, and that's why neoclassical economics in part can become ascendant with this idea that we don't have to look at income distribution. We just look at everyone, we will have growth, everyone will rise together. All social problems will be solved by growth.
And that's an outgrowth of imperialism in that era.
Yeah. I mean, it's happening. I mean, neoclassical economics becomes ascendant in the late 19th century. And which is an interesting story in its own and how it gained that ascendancy. But today, we can't do that. We have to internalize exploitation and we have to choose, and that's what's happening by default is governments and governing elites, and I would include central banks in there, are making decisions which are penalizing some groups at the expense of others or to the benefit of others. We've because we can't outsource exploitation. We can't find, the net transfer of resources from the global periphery. It's actually going the other way for the reasons we said. It's being driven by the current aristocracy, the 1%, which are not barbarian generals, but fund managers acting on behalf of their beneficiaries. And therefore, because that net flow of resources has gone the other way, then if we're going to maintain certain people in the style to which they become accustomed, somebody else must lose access to those benefits. And as I say, the way that politicians have got around this is saying, well, we'll restore 5% growth with my model, whether it's Brexit, whether it's MAGA, none of which works. Nobody has ever and will ever get a Western country back to the growth rates on which all of our promises are based. That this idea that this was not an exceptional period in history after the war. This was the new norm. And economists still believe it.
No, I know.
Well, some economists.
Those who don't know enough history, who can't put it in context.
Which is all economists, I have to say.
It's something I come back to a lot, which is that particularly Britain, we have to think of ourselves as a developing country now. And I don't think our politicians have put themselves into that mindset. Supply side problems like cheap energy, cheap housing. How do you build infrastructure? How do you upgrade human capital? But they go, no, we don't need to think about any of that. The food supply, food security. No, we just need to reduce tax. We just need to decrease corporation tax by 5% and everything will be fine. And you also see it in the migration debate. Now, I understand there's not consent in this country for high migration. I get it, right? Because of the way our electoral system works and constituencies, etc., that's just very obvious to me. But what does frustrate me is in the debate around immigration, there is just such a lack of honesty with regards to the costs and the benefits. Yeah. If you want to have immigration in tens of thousands, which we can do, in the short term, the NHS social care would collapse. Fine, but let's say you want to do it over 10 years, 15 years. Let's say you're being very pragmatic about it. Okay, fine. What's that going to mean? Inflation, because workers' wages will rise. I actually think that's probably a good thing. In whole, fine. Interest rates will probably have to go up longer term. Growth will be much lower. Tax would be much higher. We'd have to be investing money into training nurses and doctors and all other kinds of professions in this country rather than bringing them in from overseas. So higher growth, higher taxes, higher inflation. That is not what Nigel Farage is selling people.
And lower asset prices, which would in turn intensify the movement, because the only way you'd have to make up the losses is by moving even more capital offshore. So it would accelerate the absolute decline of the country.
The sheer dishonesty of political discourse around this is, well, I find it shocking, but I'm just a rarefied academic. The idea that people can quite clearly, deliberately tell untruths, which they're either stupid or liars.
But if you make this point, you go, look, you're not being honest about the reality of this. You cannot just go back to 1980s, Nigel Lawson budget by doing this and magically have all the things you want. You want low tax, you want low inflation, you want high growth, and you want low migration. It can't happen. So, well, you just want infinity migration. No, I'm just saying this thing which you've been calling for 25 years comes with a bunch of costs, and you also think some benefits. Fine. But let's talk about the costs. But they can't talk about the costs. Anyway, final question. What do we do about it? This is obviously a very bleak situation. The idea of collapse, let alone decline, is decline rather than let alone collapse, I should say, is a rather unsavory one. And I would quite like the people watching and listening to enjoy the next 40, 50 years of their life rather than live among the ruins of empire. So are there ways out here politically and economically?
Yeah, I don't think we're in a terminal state by any means. You've got to have a more honest debate about allocating governmental resources and governmental support. You've got to think about who you're supporting and why. And you've got to remove some of the structural supports for very particular groups, or identify them so that at least you talk and say, well, okay, we're doing this in practice. Is this what we really want to do? So that's one side of it. The other side is, and I was slightly startled by the kind of, well, startled, maybe too strong, but you never heard during the all the discussions about the recent election, someone say, well, actually, economic growth comes from selling stuff from inside your economic zone, outside your economic zone. What are the things that we can sell to other people? That's where sustained economic growth comes from, not fantasy debt building up on credit cards or house prices rising. Real growth comes from selling things from one economic zone into another economic zone. So what are the things that we can actually sell to other people? And you can start to think about that. I have my own particular axe to grind. One thing we've got is a really good university system that's admired worldwide. The idea that we get fee-paying bright young people from other countries coming into Britain. Oh, that's a really terrible thing to happen. Obviously, that's got to be disastrous. But this is an asset that will generate a flow of assets from overseas into Britain. Med tech, there's some very good things there. Some small, higher tech industrial stuff is certainly there. Think about it. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert in the modern economy, but frame the conversation that way. What can we sell to other people? What do we do that's good enough that it can find a real market share elsewhere?
Yeah, I think, Aaron, look, our ancestors would have dreamed of having the dilemmas we face. We are, in the aggregate, the richest society humanity has ever formed, and our prospects are good, that we will not get back to the growth rates of the post-war period, but we will continue. There's no reason we can't continue growing economically and potentially for infinity at much more modest growth, closer to 1%, on average, if we're lucky, if we do things right. So we can actually sit here around this table and say, what are we going to do with all this added wealth? I mean, we're living the best lives and we can do even better. But that entails essentially, we need to take some decisions now to say, okay, we made a bunch of promises. In fact, the promises, let's face it, were promises people made to themselves. When I'm retired, I'm going to be able to continue living this way. I'm going to be able to, whereas my father was retired for 5 years, I plan to actually spend more years retired than I did working. And yet I'm going to get a very high standard of living. And it's going to be possible because the economy is, assets will grow. This fixed rate, which has been the case in the past. And you say, well, if that's no longer the case, we've made a bunch of projections, fiscal actuarial projections, which aren't going to hold. And there's only one way to resolve this. One is you continue to live your life and then the whole system collapses. And that's when the adjustment comes. It falls wholly on your descendants. Or we begin to have a conversation about this now. We have to make this decision now. We've made some promises, and it may be that some of the promises include on issues like healthcare. Do we actually provide across, the board's access to healthcare? Do we prioritize? We need to have these candid conversations. But if we get the fiscal contract, if we basically reopen the fiscal contract, put it back together, I don't see any reason why we can't look forward to an endlessly bright future.
Yeah, there's plenty of money knocking around.
There's plenty of money knocking around. But as I say, the temptation is because some people, I think, might be prepared to have that conversation. Others are saying that involves tough choices. And so, as we know, easy choices are very popular in elections. And that's on us. That's on us voters.
Well, it is. And there was a great... I was listening to a program on the radio. I mentioned Radio 4. You can always cut that out if I'm not.
No, that's fine. I think that's the only defense for the license fee right now is Radio 4.
Yeah, they were talking about the way algorithms work. And actually, the algorithms that work are for greed, for hate, and for fear. So all the news services this is what people linger on most. So the algorithms adjust, and you just get fed the stories that sustain that vision of the world. And that, I think, as a historian, I find that really terrifying.
Well, Ben Bratton, he puts this perfectly. He says, we have built a global real-time communication network. We have built a planetary exoskeleton, which Elon Musk is adding to a rate of knots. What for? To maximize ad revenue.
Yes.
That's what it's for. And you think, holy fuck. You know,
Yes.
it's just
Absolutely
mind-boggling. The gap between the technology and the sort of the political economic software which is driving it is just crazy. In terms of the tough choices, we recently spoke to Stephanie Kelton on Downstream. She's an MMT person, and she would say this is outrageous. We can just print money forever. I have to say I'm more sympathetic to your argument. Something like financial repression, which is what we have in the 1960s. You have high public debts, but you basically ensure that inflation is higher than interest rates. And something like Adam Tooze would say, actually, a decade of 4% inflation and 2% interest rates would probably be quite good. What that means is you reduce the debt. But it also means that if I have a mortgage and it's £400,000, that evaporates much more quickly.
Yes.
And I'm into that. We did that very recently. People said, well, we had this debt after the Second World War, we overcame it, so high debts aren't a problem. The problem is, as you've already alluded to, is that there's this incredibly powerful political constituency which doesn't want higher inflation than interest rates, doesn't want financial repression, because of course it's going to hit the value of their assets. Right. And I'm particularly talking about retirees.
Yeah. Yes. And of course, we did successfully use in Western countries financial repression after the war. But at that time, the retired population was 5% of the population, but it had exactly that effect. It did, in fact, induce high rates of growth, or it supported high rates of growth. I don't want to say it induced. I'm personally not a huge fan of modern monetary theory. I've seen the math, and like so much in economics, the math can be very good, but the basic assumptions I think are flawed. And I think I won't go into detail as to why I think of it. But the basic idea that money can sort of create itself, that you basically incur debt, which enables you to generate an income which will cover the costs. I mean, there are limitations. There are only a small number of governments in the world, and perhaps today the only government left that can actually do that for any sustained period of time is the United States, where they can just print money and it will bring money in. And that has to do with being the world's reserve currency and having no competition for that status at the moment, and none emerging anytime soon. But the basic idea that you say, well, we'll borrow. I mean, debt is a brilliant invention that you sort of say, well, we can actually borrow from our future labor to create something now. And that makes eminent sense. The catch is you have to make sure, and this is where it becomes a real problem, how do you, if you've just sort of got a sort of blanket open approach to debt formation, how do you prevent politicians spending it, in fact, to do just that, to top up investment funds so that they continue to generate these returns and aren't actually adding new capital? Now, I do think it's a very necessary thing that Western governments have to start doing what the British government is starting to experiment with, which is looking at the net asset position of the public sector. I think that's critical, because one of the things that is underreported is how over the last 2 generations, Western governments have completely sold off the family jewelry to balance their budgets. And most Western governments now have a net negative asset position. There is only about 6 of them, and only one of them is strongly positive. That's Norway. And some of them are deeply negative. And that doesn't even include unfunded liabilities going forward. It's still based on the assumption that, the Canada Pension Plan is going to be able to generate 6% returns from here to kingdom come. What if we say, well, make that 4% or 3%? What happens then? It collapses, and the actual net debt of the state becomes even greater. So I think we do need to start being more ambitious in borrowing for capital accounts. But I think the idea that this is a magic solution, it would have to be done very prudently. And you'd have to, because part of the problem with public assets is the markets are not very liquid. I mean, they're not, you can't sell a school. It doesn't have the market value equal to the investment. It's only valuable as a school. And when it ceases to be a school, the building itself is not easily adapted to other uses.
I mean, this is the awful thing of the 2010s, which is you do have these incredibly low interest rates, and actually...
Yeah, it's a tragedy.
There's a different world out there where David Cameron spends $500 billion on high speed, green technology, scrapping fees, making a more educated populace, building homes. And these were all, for the most part, revenue generating or productivity enabling investments. But like you say, run deficits to do that stuff, of course, good, invest for the future. You should not, I think, and we agree. I think other people agree too. John McDonnell agreed in 2019. You should not be using deficits to finance things like pensions or things that people will be spending on day to day.
You can't. But I think the electoral cycle means that you're kind of suckered into doing it as a politician. That's my feeling as a historian looking at this. The political pressure on you to deliver in those kind of areas is so strong, given the electoral cycle and given who votes, that it's really hard.
Well, I'm writing a book about this. I think one of the underpriced aspects of an aging society is we don't realise how buggered we are with our political culture. We now live in a world where I think youth movements don't matter, right? And people are still hardwired to think it's like the 1960s. All these young people are doing this. Doesn't matter. Go to the Marks and Spencer cafe on a weekday and see everybody in there 70 years old having their cups of tea. They're the people that matter, and they'll matter for a long time. Gents, This has been great. And the book, Why Empire's Fall, I say only 166 pages, I think. It's every single page is a pleasure, but if you're hard on time, it's absolutely worth reading. And I hope to get you both on again soon.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Be a pleasure. Love to. Yeah.